Welcome back to the archive. I'm Paul, and today I want to start with something you are doing right now. You are reading, or if you're watching this, someone is reading to you, which is, in fact, the older version. Here is what the archive tells me about that sentence. For most of human history, reading was not something ordinary people did. It was something done to them. A priest read to them. A lord's clerk read to them. God's words reached them through another man's mouth. You did not read, you listened. You believed what you were told the text said. And here is the part that stops me every time I sit with this record. Reading silently, the way you were doing it right now, was considered strange, possibly suspicious, possibly dangerous. Saint Augustine, writing in the late 4th century, described watching his teacher Ambrose read without moving his lips. He found it remarkable. He wrote about it as if it were a kind of miracle, a man reading without making a sound. That is the record I want to open today. Not the history of the alphabet, not the invention of writing, the history of who was allowed to read and what happened when that permission was finally taken away from the people who controlled it. If you're new to this archive, welcome to Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire. Subscribe before we go further. What we find here you will not find summarized anywhere else. Let's open the record. Every record in this archive tells two stories: the story of what happened and the story of what was already there, the system that had been in place for so long that no one questioned it. Europe, around 1050 AD. There was a man I keep returning to in this archive. His name was William. Not a saint, not a scholar, a peasant. William farmed land that belonged to his lord. He paid tithes to his church. He went to Mass every Sunday. He heard the Bible read aloud, in Latin. He did not speak Latin. He had no idea what the words meant. He stood in the church every week of his life, every Christmas, every Easter, every ordinary Sunday, and listened to words he could not understand, in a language he did not know, from a book he had never touched. And this was normal. This was how it was supposed to work. Because, the church argued, the Bible was a dangerous document. Not dangerous in the way we might think. Dangerous because it could be misunderstood. If ordinary people read it, people without proper training, without theological education, without the church's guidance, they might reach the wrong conclusions. They might think things that were incorrect. And incorrect thinking in the medieval church's worldview was not just an intellectual error, it was a threat to your soul. So the solution was simple. Don't let them read it. Let the priests read it. Let the priests understand it. Let the priests tell the people what it meant. The church was not, in its own view, withholding information. It was protecting people from themselves. And it worked. For centuries it worked. Because reading required books. Books required monks to copy them. Monks were trained by the church. The church controlled the monasteries. The monasteries controlled the books. The chain of control was complete. I want to stay in William's world for a moment longer, because the archive shows me something that is easy to miss if you've been able to read your entire life. Not being able to read was not simply not knowing letters. It meant something else entirely. It meant that every document that touched your life, and documents touched everyone's life, even William's, existed in a language you could not access. William's tenancy agreement, the contract that determined what land he could farm, what he owed his lord, what would happen if he failed to pay, was a written document. He had never read it. He had never been able to read it. He knew what it said because a clerk had read it to him the day he signed it, or, more accurately, the day he made his mark on it. Because William could not sign his name, he pressed his thumb into the wax, and trusted that what the clerk had told him was what the document actually said. This was not unusual.
This was the normal condition of almost everyone in William's world. Your entire legal existence, your rights, your obligations, your property, your debts, lived in documents you could not read, and the person who read them to you had enormous power. They could tell you the document said one thing when it said another. They could omit, they could simplify, they could lie. Not always, not even often, but always, potentially. The inability to read was not just ignorance, it was a permanent structural vulnerability. William's father had died the previous winter. He left a will. A priest had written it. William sat in the church while the priest read it aloud. He listened carefully. He tried to remember every word, but he could not verify what was written. He could not reread it later. He could not check whether the priest had read it accurately. The will said what the priest said it said. That was all William knew. And when a dispute arose, as disputes often did, over a small piece of land his father had intended for him, William stood in the Lord's court and tried to argue his case against a document he could not read. The Lord's clerk read the document to the court. William said, "That is not what it says." The clerk said, "Yes, it is." William had no way to prove otherwise. He lost the land. He never thought to blame his inability to read. He blamed bad luck. He blamed the clerk. He blamed his father for not being clearer. He never once considered that the system had been designed so that men like him could not win arguments about documents. That was the genius of it. The people inside the system could not see the system.
Now, let me show you what reading looked like in William's world, because it looked nothing like what you are doing now. In the medieval world, reading was almost always done aloud, not quietly, aloud. You moved your lips, you whispered, you spoke. Sometimes you read at full voice, projecting across a room. This was not considered a lesser form of reading. This was reading. When a monk sat in the scriptorium copying a manuscript, he read each word aloud as he wrote it. When a scholar studied a text, he spoke the words as he processed them. When a priest prepared a sermon, he read aloud to himself, to hear the words, to feel them, to understand them through sound as well as sight. Reading was an oral act. It was physical. It involved the mouth and the breath as much as the eye. And this shaped everything about how knowledge worked. Because if reading is oral, then knowledge is communal. It exists in a room. It requires an audience. Someone reads, others listen. The knowledge flows in one direction, from the reader to the listeners. The reader has power. The listeners receive. William stood in that church every Sunday as a listener. He had always been a listener. His father had been a listener, his grandfather before him. The world was divided, as far as William knew, into two kinds of people, those who read and those who were read to. He had never considered that this division was anything other than natural.
I want to stay with William for a moment longer, because the archive gives me one specific record that I find remarkable. A village priest, somewhere in England, sometime around 1000, taught a peasant to read. Not deeply, not Latin, not scripture, but the man's own name and a few words from a prayer. The priest carved the letters in soft clay first, so William could trace them with his finger, then scratched them on slate, then showed him the same letters in the margins of a psalter. It took months, and when William first recognized the letters of his own name in a document, he wept. The record says he wept, not from happiness exactly, from the shock of recognition. He had seen documents all his life. He had seen letters all his life. He had assumed they were for other people, a closed door that he had never questioned. And then the door opened, just a crack, just his own name, but the door had opened, and the priest, the record says, was afraid. Not afraid of William, afraid of what he had done, because he had given William something that could not be taken back.
The first record I want to show you is not about books. It is about control, specifically about who controlled meaning. In the medieval world, to read was to interpret, and to interpret was to have power. The Church understood this with extraordinary clarity. When the Fourth Lateran Council met in 1215, it issued a series of rulings about education and literacy. Among them, that no one should preach without authorization from the Church, not because preaching was dangerous, because unauthorized preaching meant unauthorized interpretation. If a man read the Bible and then told his neighbors what it meant without the Church's permission, he was not just spreading ideas, he was claiming the right to decide what God's words meant, and that right belonged to Rome. The monks who copied manuscripts understood this too. In the great scriptoria, the copying rooms of the monasteries, books were chained to the shelves, not to prevent theft exactly, to prevent the wrong person from reading them. A chained book could be read by a monk with permission. It could not be carried away. It could not be copied without authorization. It could not reach the wrong hands. The chain was not a lock. It was a policy. William's world operated entirely within this system. Knowledge had a hierarchy. At the top, Rome, then bishops, then priests, then somewhere far below, the people who were read to. William was not at the bottom of this hierarchy because he was unintelligent. He was at the bottom because the system required someone to be there. The entire structure depended on most people not reading. If everyone read, everyone could interpret. If everyone could interpret, who needed the Church to do it for them? This is the first mechanism, not ignorance, control of the monopoly on meaning. The second record is about a moment so quiet that most histories barely notice it. A student, somewhere in Bologna, around 1200. He was reading a text, a legal commentary, dense, difficult, Latin. And somewhere in the middle, he closed his mouth. He stopped speaking the words aloud. He continued reading, in silence. He wasn't the first person ever to read silently. Augustine had written about Ambrose doing it 8 centuries earlier. But by 1200, in the new universities that were emerging across Europe, something was shifting. Students had to share rooms, they had to share desks, they had to study while others studied beside them. Reading aloud in a crowded room where everyone else was also reading aloud was chaos. So they began to read quietly, not as a philosophical choice, as a practical necessity. But the consequences were enormous. Because silent reading is private reading. When you read aloud, someone else can hear what you are reading. Someone else can know what ideas are entering your mind. When you read silently, the text is between you and the page. No one else is present. And if no one else is present, the interpretation belongs to you. The reader becomes their own priest. They decide what the text means. They agree or disagree with no one watching. They question in silence. They doubt in silence. They believe in silence. This is the moment, quiet, undramatic, born from the practical problem of too many students in too small a room, when the monopoly on meaning began to crack. Not because of a reformer, not because of a revolution, because students needed to concentrate, and one of them closed his mouth.
Now, I want to sit with that moment a little longer, because the full consequence took centuries to arrive, but the direction was set in that quiet room in Bologna. Before silent reading, a scholar needed a teacher to unlock a text. The teacher read, the teacher explained, the teacher told you what the authorities said about what the author meant.
You received the interpretation. After silent reading, a scholar could sit alone with a text and disagree with it, silently, without being overheard, without being challenged, without being corrected. This sounds small. It was not small. Every great reformer of the medieval and early modern period, every person who looked at an old text and thought, "This is not what it says," was a silent reader. Martin Luther was a silent reader. He sat alone with Paul's letter to the Romans. He read it in silence. He formed his own opinion about what it meant, and then he nailed it to a door. John Wycliffe was a silent reader. He translated the Bible into English so that ordinary people could read it themselves, silently, and form their own conclusions. The church called this heresy. They were right that it was a threat. They just couldn't stop it. Because once you have taught someone to read silently, you cannot control what they read. You cannot control what they think. You cannot control what conclusions they reach alone with a page. William, our peasant with his name traced in clay, would never become a silent reader, but his grandchildren might, and their grandchildren almost certainly would. The door that opened with just his name did not close again.
The third record is the one I find most quietly devastating, because it shows what happened when the people who controlled reading realized they were losing control. England, 1401. Parliament passed a law, the De Heretico Comberendo, on the burning of heretics. Among its provisions that anyone found teaching or preaching without authorization could be arrested, that anyone found with unauthorized texts translated into English without church approval, could be imprisoned, that anyone convicted of heresy, defined to include reading unauthorized interpretations, could be burned alive. This was not a new idea. Heresy laws had existed for centuries, but this particular law was aimed at something specific. It was aimed at people who were reading the Bible in English, not scholars, not clergy, ordinary people. The followers of John Wycliffe, called the Lollards, had been meeting in houses, in fields, in forests, and reading scripture to each other, in English, not Latin. The horror was not the heresy. The horror was the access. An English Bible meant that a farmer could read it, a weaver could read it, a woman could read it. A woman. In much of medieval Europe, women were explicitly forbidden from reading scripture, not discouraged, forbidden. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, women should be silent in churches. The interpretation, women should not read aloud in churches. The extension, women should not read at all. Because if you read, you might have opinions, and if you have opinions, the order of things becomes unclear. William would have understood none of this. He only knew that when he recognized the letters of his name, something shifted in him, something that had no name yet. But the people who had always controlled what those letters meant, they felt the shift too. And they were afraid.
I want to show you what literacy as threat actually looked like on the ground. Not in Parliament, not in the church courts. In a house, in a field, in a forest at night. England, around 1390. A woman named Agnes, the records give us this name, though little else, lived in a village in the Midlands. She could not read, but she had a neighbor who could, and that neighbor had pages, not a full Bible, just pages, torn from a manuscript, written in English. The neighbor had carried them from Leicester, wrapped in cloth, sewn inside a jacket. On Sundays, when everyone was supposed to be in church hearing the Latin read, Agnes and 4 other villagers gathered in Agnes's house. The neighbor read aloud, in English, the same words William heard every Sunday in Latin, but now comprehensible. Agnes wept, not from happiness exactly, from the shock of recognition. She had heard these words all her life. She had assumed they were for other people, for educated people, for Latin people, for Rome. And now, in her own house, on a Sunday afternoon, she discovered they were also for her. This was the Lollard movement, named mockingly from a Dutch word meaning mumbler, because that is what their enemies called them, people who mumbled scripture in the vernacular, in English, in fields. The church's response was immediate and precise. A Lollard could be arrested, a Lollard could be tried, a Lollard could be burned, and they were. In 1401, the year of De Heretico Comburendo, a man named William Sawtry became the first person in England to be burned for heresy under the new law. His crime was not violence. His crime was not theft. His crime was reading and teaching others to read. Agnes knew this. She knew what happened to people who gathered with English pages. After the law passed, she stopped attending the readings. She put the pages, which the neighbor had left with her when he fled south, under the floorboards of her house. She left them there for 6 months. Then she took them out and read them again, alone this time, silently, because by then she had learned to read, letter by letter, word by word, the same way William had learned his name from the priest who scratched it in clay. Except Agnes had no priest. She taught herself from the pages under the floor. The record of Agnes survives because she was arrested in 1393, tried for heresy, asked to recant. She recanted. The record says she wept when she recanted. It does not say what she thought while she was weeping, but the archive keeps these records, not to judge her, to remember what it cost to hold a page in a language you understood in a world that had decided you were not supposed to.
Let me take you to the last room in this section of the archive, the room where all 3 records are laid out together, side by side. Europe, 500 AD. Almost no one reads. The knowledge is in the monasteries. The monks copy it. The priests deliver it. The people receive it. And 3 mechanisms activate. First, reading as privilege, not an accident, not ignorance, a system, a chain of control running from Rome to the village priest to William standing in the church not understanding a word. The monopoly on meaning was the monopoly on power, and it lasted 1,000 years. Second, the first quiet revolution. A student closes his mouth, reads in silence. The text becomes private. The interpretation becomes personal. The reader becomes their own authority, not through rebellion, through the practical problem of too many people in too small a room. The revolution happened in the space between a reader and a page, without witnesses, without announcement. Third, literacy as threat. The moment the powerful noticed what was happening, the laws came, the burnings came, the bans on English Bibles came, the prohibitions on women reading came. Not because reading was dangerous in the abstract, because reading gave the person holding the page the power to decide what it meant, and that power, for 1,000 years, had belonged to someone else. None of this was inevitable. A monk sat in a scriptorium and copied words he wasn't sure he understood. A student closed his mouth. A priest scratched letters in clay for a peasant who wept when he recognized his name. And those 3 acts, separated by centuries, became the foundation of every argument you have ever had about what a text really means. That is what the archive held today. Not the story of the invention of the alphabet. The story of a man who stood in a church every Sunday of his life, listening to words he didn't understand and never thought to question it. And of the priest who gave him his own name in letters that he could trace with his finger. And of the student who closed his mouth and changed the world without knowing it. And of the woman who was told she was not allowed to read and read anyway. If this changed the way you see something, share it with one person. That is how this archive grows. And if you haven't subscribed to Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire yet, the doors are open. Next time, I'll take you to a different shelf entirely. The archive is deep, and what's on the next shelf, you won't expect. I'm Paul, archivist of Paul's Lost Knowledge Empire. Stay curious and keep reading.